This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. I've seen several references to isolated Appalachia lately, even in headlines of nationally known news organizations. And I've heard the phrase used locally by professionals, one just last week. So let's talk and think about why, quote unquote, isolated is a problematic way to think about the region in 2024. Subscribe and review us wherever you listen and on YouTube. Recommend your favorite episodes to friends and share them on social. If you'd like to join one of the Talkin' Appalachian communities to talk about these words and topics, or to find out about events, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. For access to bonus episodes, early content, and the scoop on new merchandise dropping soon, subscribe to Talkin' Appalachian on Patreon. And remember to keep talkin' Appalachian. Isolation is basically defined as a sense of aloneness. But in more technical terms, isolation is about forced segregation away from others, sort of like solitary confinement in prison or being placed in your own room in an infectious disease ward. So it's something that some people choose to do, but it's also a punishment and a way of keeping other people safe or keeping yourself insulated from those you don't want to be around. It also conjures the image of who can't or won't get out. Therein is the problem when you use the word together with any discussion of Appalachia. It reinforces an old, outdated idea. Nancy Hayward and I write about the perceptions of Appalachia in the introduction to the book Talking Appalachian, and we quote heavily from Jeff Bigger's wonderful book, The United States of Appalachia, when he talks about the 4 images of Appalachia that persist. He writes about pristine Appalachia. He writes about, quote, pristine Appalachia, the unspoiled mountains and hills along the Appalachian Trail. Backwater Appalachia, home of the strange land and peculiar people, in thousands of stories, novels, radio, and TV programs and films. Anglo-Saxon Appalachia, once defined by Merriam-Webster's College Dictionary as a mountain region of white natives, despite its role at a crossroads of indigenous cultures and vast immigrant and African-American migrations for centuries. And pitiful Appalachia, poster region of welfare and privation. And these are the 4 images of Appalachia that he says persist to this day. And just a reminder, Jeff Bigger's book is called The United States of Appalachia because he's referencing Washington Irving, who wrote in 1839 that the country should be named the United States of Appalachia or Alleghania because of the mountain chain that is the noble backbone of the United States. But anyway, pitiful Appalachia is the image that I'm afraid people equate with isolation. But none of these exclusively represents the whole of the region. There's the pristine, romantic, isolated Appalachia where time is frozen and nothing ever changes. And if you look hard enough in any part of the United States, you'll find those places. I remember living in rural Pennsylvania during my PhD program and driving up to some of the Amish communities there. And some might call those places isolated, but they have roads and highways and tourists. Tangier Island, which is 3 miles long and just 12 miles off the shore between the eastern shore and mainland of Virginia, is another place that people would like to refer to as isolated. In fact, National Geographic calls it just that. It's literally an island populated by about 500 people. And isolated comes from the Latin word for island, by the way. So you access it by ferry or boat. And people have lived their whole lives there, speaking with a unique, very old dialect dating back to the 17th century, with features that are so well preserved it's widely studied. As with any populated island, preservation is one outcome of fewer people migrating in and out. But geographically, I wouldn't call it isolated. It's not hard to find. People can come and go, and residents depend on tourism. If residents want to go shopping on the mainland for the day, they take the mailboat to places like Baltimore, where they keep their cars in a parking garage. Tourists catch the ferry on the eastern shore to get to the island, so the people of Tangier have created some income from hospitality services, interacting with tourists in their bed and breakfasts, their restaurants, their beaches. The people of Tangier have made choices to preserve and protect their culture and their way of life, from refusing a movie to be filmed there to banning public alcohol consumption. So isolated may be better known as solitude, which is a self-seeking island. It's the tranquility that people who aren't from Appalachia seek when they buy homes here in the rural, less populated areas, away from artificial light and noise, away from the upside-down disparities in cost of living versus what they're being paid. In Mountainside, Virginia, you can buy a home and land with a view for a fraction of what you'd pay in the northern part of the state, where the cost of living is so high. Teachers are leaving their professions because they can't afford to live on the pay. And if you want to see a wonderful documentary made by a student, a short little documentary that was actually created by a high school student about that very problem, you can go to the Appalachian Writing Project Facebook page, and I've linked it there on that page, but I'll also link it here in the show notes. The Appalachian Writing Project is a page for teachers in Appalachia, so hope you'll go over there and join. So people who aren't in that predicament may pay a lot of money to seek solitude in books, on retreats, vacations. Kafka said solitude is a way of knowing ourselves, though he wasn't the happiest guy and he did die young. But Thoreau built a cabin in the woods of Concord, Massachusetts, and wrote a whole book about it. And people seek that kind of solitude in Appalachia when they hike our famous trail, for example. But isolated is rarely used when people want to talk about places in a positive way. You see it in headlines about disparity. It's eye-catching, and it's clickbait. It's easy, and it's the tool of a lazy writer. Using isolated tries to pull us back into a time when local color writers and song catchers roamed the mountains looking for people, words, and songs that could be traced to their European ancestors. This was a time before cars, even before railroads, when a commute of just a few miles could take days on horseback or foot. People were rooted in communities where their families settled, in coves and hollers that may have been hard to get into and out of because of the terrain. And color writers loved it because it created a context of mystery. Perry County, Kentucky lawyer and judge Josiah Combs claimed in the late 1800s that the Southern mountaineers are the conservators of old, early, and Elizabethan English in the New World. I'm quoting him. Quote, "These 4 million mountaineers of the South, from West Virginia to northern Alabama, form the body of what is perhaps the purest Old English blood to be found among English-speaking peoples. Isolated from the outside world and shut in by natural barriers, they have for more than 2 centuries preserved much of the language of Elizabethan England." So other high-ranking people echoed his words, and that anchored that idea into Appalachian history. Then writers like George Washington Harris, author of the Loving Good Tales, and Mary Knowles Murphy, who wrote many books under the name Charles Craddock, wrote comedy and romance, further cementing these ideas about a wild, isolated, backward, romantic Appalachia that mainstream Americans in the 1800s and early 1900s could only find in books. Michael Montgomery, the linguist, in chapter 1 of my book, even said that Horace Kephart did this. He studied one small community in the Smoky Mountain foothills of East Tennessee and studied the way they lived and their dialect, but he attributed that to a much larger, he attributed what he found to a much, much larger portion of Appalachia, which was sort of misleading because what he wrote about was small. Author John Fox Jr. arguably did the same thing in The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. He's a Kentucky author who transplanted here to Big Stone Gap in 1890. His books were turned into silent movies in the early 20th century. An outdoor drama and musical based on The Trail of the Lonesome Pine is the crown jewel of Big Stone Gap entertainment every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from June to August. It's a tale of a coal prospector who finds a young Appalachian girl who can sing and helps her get out of violent Appalachia to New York, where she can be formally trained. Fun fact, I played June Tolliver. I was the understudy, but I got to play her one summer when I was 16. But if you ever come to Big Stone, you can tour his house. His typewriter and his desk are right there. The movie posters from the silent movies that were made from his books. And he wrote some really good books. And all of these authors, by the way, did a great job of preserving language in their own right, because they were writing these things down before video, before audio. And so, writers like Fox and Harris and Murphy, they did record some of the actual words and phrases that they heard. But I think the problem with where sort of the myths of Appalachia that still persisted were these ideas that everyone, here, it was wild and untamed, and that everyone spoke in this Elizabethan English and Chaucerian English, and that just took hold and never let go. And I think at one time, Appalachia was a very different place. It was sort of wild and untamed, but things change, and people change, and migration patterns and things like that. So a lot of things changed. In the 1940s, Appalachia experienced a great outmigration to the northern industrial centers, with millions of people traveling on Highway 23. I drive on Highway 23 almost every day. It goes, here, it transverses 3 states right here where I live, but it goes all the way up north. People traveled there looking for good paying, steady work in factories. Many of them stayed, but some were so homesick that they came back to see friends and family on the weekends. 23 became known as Hillbilly Highway, and Steve Earle wrote and recorded a song about it in the 1980s. It was recorded again in 1997 by Ricky Skaggs. With television and movies beginning in the 1950s with CBS Christmas in Appalachia and Harvest of Shame documentaries, then Deliverance in the 1970s, people got the full sensory experience of perceived isolation coupled with poverty, and then isolation coupled with violence and inbreeding. Cue all the jokes that followed the commercialization of those jokes, like t-shirts that say paddle faster, I hear banjo music. Appalachia became forever linked to the stereotypes that can be conjured by one word. Isolation became synonymous not just with poverty, but with fear. How can a region be isolated now when it's 900 miles long and includes 13 states? About 25 million people live here based on census data, and 9 million live in Appalachia's metro and small metro areas. Yes, we have urban Appalachia, as well as rural Appalachia and suburban Appalachia. We have nearly 600 colleges and universities in the region, and most people are employed in professional and technical sectors. Linguist Michael Montgomery said that Appalachia hasn't been isolated since the invention of the train. And yet, there are problems, too many to name. We know about the opioid epidemic, which wasn't caused by isolation because those drugs made their way to Appalachian suburbs down interstate highways from the north, peddled first to people dealing with pain and blue-collar industries, and then to kids who didn't know what it could do to them. We know there's a disparity of wealth and health services in certain parts of our region, but that boils down to politics and bottlenecked funding that doesn't make its way from the non-Appalachian part of a state to the mountain part. Perception matters in how parts of Appalachia are treated. Use the word isolation, and that seems the perfect place for landfills and prisons, not so appealing for more positive industries that won't cause negative impacts to the environment or to the mind or to water. Say the word isolation, and suddenly school districts are struggling for more funding than other parts of the states, leaving teachers so burned out and feeling so invisible they're leaving the profession here too, but for very different reasons. This year marks the 10th anniversary of a movie that Big Stone Gap, Virginia native Adriana Trigiani made based on her novel series called Big Stone Gap. Adriana also has a wonderful podcast called You Are What You Read. Please check it out. She held out for years, fighting to film it on location where the story is set. She called on local businesses and people to help make the movie and spent her funding here to showcase what this area had to offer. She invited me to read the script and gave her feedback on the spoken dialect. Her actors came and lived here among us, Patrick Wilson, who also spent his summers here as a kid with his grandparents, Whoopi Goldberg, Ashley Judd from nearby Kentucky, Jenna Elfman. It may have been harder because we're rural to make this movie here, but it wasn't impossible. It was a love letter to a place she knew well. And I wish more people who use the word isolated would get to know the real us. I'm thankful for writers and directors like Adriana, and musicians and documentary filmmakers and visual artists and podcasters like those I've interviewed in season 1 and those I'll introduce to you in season 2. People who are moving their work about Appalachia into the mainstream and rewriting that age-old story, to move thinking into modern times and away from misunderstandings that set us back. This summer, millions of people are pouring into this region that people mistakenly call isolated. They're coming by the millions to the Smoky Mountains. They were here this past weekend to see the famous synchronous fireflies. To Dollywood and Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg. They're watching baseball in Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. They're whitewater rafting in West Virginia, doing it all at Fun Fest in Kingsport, Tennessee. They're camping. They're coming to hundreds of festivals that will go all the way through the fall harvest, celebrating everything from ramps to Harry Potter to apples. They're coming to concerts like Gathering in the Gap and Blue Highway Fest here in Big Stone. They're going to museums and national parks. They're traveling over paved roads and highways, still curvy in lots of places, but roads that unfurl like ribbons through towns blended in old and new. They're coming to the birthplace of country music in Bristol, where they can stand in Virginia and Tennessee at one time, or down to Cumberland Gap, where you can stand in Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and then make your way up to Hensley Settlement in nearby Kentucky, where a community settled in 1845 and literally lived off the land until Sherman Hensley, the last man living, came down the mountain in 1951. When you hear someone use isolated and Appalachia in the same sentence, I invite you to consider place that it comes from. Is it assumption? Is it ridicule? Or is it ignorance? And then I invite you to reach for a book written by someone who knows better, or a link to a documentary that truly shows Appalachia as it is today. Better yet, share this podcast episode or any podcast episode about the real Appalachia. Educate. Be an ambassador. I think we just have to remember that words have power. This is something I reinforce to the teachers I work with, the students that I teach, my own children. Words have power. I'm more sensitive to words than the average person because that's my vocation. And that's what I've built this podcast around. They matter. They have meaning. They have history. But when you hear words like this, I think it's because it's a secondhand thought. Like I said, it's easy. It's clickbait. And maybe just ask, why do you think Appalachia is isolated? Maybe just ask that question. Where do you think about Appalachia being isolated? The likelihood of them being able to answer that is probably slim, because it's really, you can point to these places that may be deep in the hollers still, or deep, my family lives in a holler, and I spent this last Saturday deep in a holler, where my dad has a little place on the river, and got my kayak and paddled around in the Powell River. And by all accounts, it's pretty isolated, right? But I voluntarily got there and I voluntarily left. And I know that the people who live there could voluntarily get there and leave at any time. So even in 2024, isolated is more of a state of mind than the reality. So I think the best thing that we can do to educate people who don't really understand Appalachia is to share all of those wonderful things that are coming out of the region, all of the art, share an episode of a podcast, share a movie, share a documentary, share a book, share a short story. You can do that easily with a digital click, but share something of value about the region and educate people. Because that's always what this podcast has been designed to do, is to replace myth with reality, or one of the many realities. I'm not saying that I know all of it, but there are a lot of us out there trying to do this work in the podcast arena or with books or with documentaries or whatever. And that's why we do it, because everybody has a piece of the story to tell. I had a few minutes left over, so I wanted to share with you one of my favorite places to visit. It's a historic hotel that I thought some of you might want to try out if you're going up Interstate 81 and you're on your way through Stanton, maybe on your way to DC or further north. The Blackburn Inn and Conference Center. It's in Stanton, Virginia, on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains, just along the 81 corridor. It was formerly the Western State Mental Hospital. And in its heyday, history says that it offered some of the best mental health care in the state. Now, that would have been the mental health care techniques of the time. But what's remarkable about this is the restoration of the main building. They turned it into this beautiful building that still retains its history. And it's a really large campus with lots of buildings. Some of them have been renovated into high-end apartments, and some of them are still sitting empty and they're ivy covered and broken windows and things. But I think that adds to the mystery of the place and the beauty of the place. But there are walking paths. There's a great big front porch where you can sit and read and watch the sun go down. There are fountains on the front lawn. They have music sometimes. You can take a blanket and sit on the front lawn with your wine and listen to music. Because it was a mental hospital, there are these little details in the inn that remind you of that. From these narrow staircases, the entryway has this giant sweeping staircase. It's absolutely gorgeous. But some of the doors still have you can see beyond the paint, you can see where they had the little sliding panels where they would slide trays of food into the patients. And this also at one time was a prison. And so I guess they would use it for the same purpose. Now, the history that I'm giving you makes it sound like, well, how can it be so beautiful? But a protege of Thomas Jefferson, his last name was Blackburn, also designed this inn. And so the architecture is just breathtaking. You really can't take a bad picture on the place, and it's very reasonably priced. Add to that the fact that you can walk to town. If you are the walking sort, you can literally, check in, put your stuff down, and walk to dinner anywhere in town, and then walk back. There's a wonderful former train depot. They have an Amtrak that runs right through town, but there's also trains that are shipping containers running through town as well. But there's an old train depot near the Amtrak station that's been converted into a restaurant. And so we walked there on this last visit. We walked there for dinner. It was really, really good. Try the Blackburn Inn the next time. We got up on Saturday and they had a wonderful little farmer's market in town that we walked to. We got some great deals from local farmers and vendors. And we were there for the state track meet and just really took advantage of what the town had to offer. You know me, I like anything historical. So I would just happen to be reading the most recent Pulitzer winner, Jane Ann Phillips' Night Watch, which is also set at a mental hospital in Civil War era West Virginia. So it was kind of neat to be at a former mental hospital reading a book that was set at another one from the same time period. When you do the walk, there's a walking path. And at one time, of course, this was a self-sufficient place. So they had a dairy. They had everything they needed to live and farm and everything right there on the property. But the walking path sort of leads you around toward the dairy. But if you look to your left up in the woods, you see this really peaceful place, and it's the patient graves. So when they died, they buried them back there. And it's kind of sad because the graves are just numbered, but there are so many of them. It's like I said, it's a serene, since we're talking about isolation, I would call this solitude. It's a place of solitude and very elegant, but reasonably priced. They're not paying me to say this. I just happen to really love the place and just wanted to share that with you. Let me know if you stay there. Tell them you heard it on the Talking Appalachian podcast.